Hey, welcome back. Grab your coffee, sit down, because I need about 18 minutes of your evening, and I promise it's worth it. When I was about 9 years old, a shelf in our garage collapsed, and my mother's good ceramic pot smashed on the concrete. I was standing next to it. There was no version of events where I wasn't the prime suspect. I got the lecture, I did the extra chores. Case closed in the household justice system in about 11 minutes flat. 11 years later, the whole garage got renovated, and the contractor found something interesting behind the drywall: termites. They'd been quietly hollowing out that support beam for the better part of a decade. The shelf wasn't going to survive the week no matter who was standing next to it. I just happened to be a convenient breathing explanation at the exact moment it gave way. I tell you that story because Washington, D.C. just spent 5 weeks running the exact same play on a much bigger stage, with a much bigger budget, and a 67-year-old former Olympic athlete standing in for 9-year-old me. Here's the part everyone already half knows. Back in June, the Trump administration was in the middle of a beautification push around the National Mall, repainting, recoding, getting things photo-ready ahead of the America 250 celebrations and the 4th of July. Part of that job was a new liner for the Lincoln Memorial Reflecting Pool, 2,000 feet long, 167 feet wide, sitting right between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument, about as symbolically loaded a body of water as exists in the country. And sometime in June, that new liner started peeling, delaminating, coming apart at the seams, visibly, publicly, on the one stretch of grass in America where cameras are basically always pointed. Now, a peeling pool liner is not a great look heading into a national anniversary celebration. So somebody needed an explanation that wasn't, "we rushed the job." And on June 19th, David Hearn, a former U.S. Olympic canoeist, 67 years old, out on a 64-mile bike ride, because apparently that's just a Tuesday for this guy, stopped at the pool, reached down, and touched a loose section of the coating. A National Park Service employee told him to stop. U.S. Park Police arrested him. And the story that went out to the public, repeated on cable news for weeks, was vandalism. Deliberate, malicious destruction of federal property. 6 people arrested, 7 cited, the president himself telling reporters the damage included, and I'm not making this up, giant letters spray-painted into the grass. On July 2nd, Jeanine Pirro, U.S., attorney for the District of Columbia, longtime Trump ally, former Fox News host, walked a grand jury through the evidence and secured a felony indictment against Hearn for destruction of property. And then, 5 weeks later, on a Friday, Pirro's own office quietly filed a 20-page motion asking a judge to throw the whole thing out. Not because Hearn made a deal, not because a witness recanted, because it turned out the government's own case had a termite problem. According to the filing, the Interior Department had initially handed prosecutors what Pirro's office called bare-bones reports. And only after the indictment did fuller documentation surface, showing the real cause was, in the government's own words, a rushed and botched installation process by the contractor, Atlantic Industrial Coatings, working under time pressure to get the pool photo-ready before the July 4th events. The motion states, in language you don't often see a U.S. Attorney's Office use about its own case, that it's difficult to attribute the widespread damage to the reflecting pool to vandalism, let alone to establish that fact beyond a reasonable doubt. 3 other people charged in connection with the pool had their cases dropped the same week. All of it gone in the space of about 72 hours. So, let's sit with that for a second, because that's not a footnote. That's the Department of Justice admitting in a signed court filing that it indicted a 67-year-old cyclist for a crime that appears to have been committed by a rushed contractor and a leaky liner. Naturally, the president had thoughts. Trump had already posted on Truth Social that he disagreed 100% with dropping the case, insisting it was a pure case of vandalism, all caps, because subtlety has never really been the House style. Then, in the Oval Office, he went further, telling reporters Pirro choked because the judge overseeing the case had been, in his words, unfriendly to her, that she'd folded like an umbrella. When a reporter tried to follow up on what that meant for her job, he told her on camera, "You're fake news, don't ever talk again." Which, I want to be fair here, is not actually an answer to the question, but it is, in its own way, very on brand. Here's what I find genuinely fascinating about that exchange, and I promise this is the point of the whole video, not just a fun aside. Trump wasn't defending the facts of the case. He never went back and relitigated the liner, the contractor, the timeline. He went straight to blaming the judge and then his own hand-picked prosecutor for the crime of writing down what the evidence actually said. The problem, in his framing, was never that an innocent man got indicted. The problem was that somebody admitted it in writing. That's worth pausing on, because it tells you what the actual chain of accountability looks like inside this administration. It's not evidence up, conclusion down. It's conclusion first. Vandals did this because admitting a beautification project got botched is politically inconvenient, and then everyone downstream is expected to make the evidence match the conclusion or take the fall for not managing to. Pirro, by all accounts, a deeply loyal ally who spent years defending Trump on Fox News before he put her in that job, discovered in real time what a lot of people discover in this administration eventually. Loyalty runs one direction until the moment it becomes expensive. And it's not just optics. Interior Secretary Doug Burgum publicly pushed back on his own administration's Justice Department, posting that his agency had handed over everything requested, including expert and eyewitness testimony, pointing to vandals, not contractors. So now you've got the Justice Department and the Interior Department in the same administration, publicly contradicting each other about who broke the pool, while the man they spent 5 weeks calling a criminal walks around with a dismissed felony charge and, depending on how his attorneys play the next few weeks, quite possibly a much bigger problem for the people who accused him. Because here's where this stops being a quirky local news story about a canoeist and a puddle and starts being an actual legal and political headache with a shelf life measured in months, not days. First, the dismissal itself isn't clean. Pirro's office asked the judge to dismiss without prejudice, which is legal speak for, we're dropping it for now, but we reserve the right to come back and try again later. Hearn's attorneys, including Norm Eisen, a name you'll recognize if you follow this kind of thing, immediately filed their own motion asking for dismissal with prejudice instead, meaning gone permanently, no second bite at the apple, full stop. Their filing leans hard on something you don't see argued very often, that the President of the United States has been publicly, repeatedly, and vocally insisting the man is guilty while the case is still technically alive, which makes it more than a little difficult to argue Hearn could ever get a fair second run at this if the government tried again. That's now sitting in front of a judge, and how it gets resolved will say a lot about how much independence the D.C. courts are willing to assert here. Second, and this is the part that should genuinely worry anyone who works in media law, Hearn spent 5 weeks as the public face of a federal vandalism case that multiple outlets and multiple on-air commentators treated as an open and shut story of a deranged Trump-hating vandal defacing a national monument before any of the contractor evidence became public, before the government itself walked it back. He was, for a news cycle, a convenient villain in a story that made for good television. And America has actually run this experiment before. You may remember the name Richard Jewell, the security guard who was publicly named as the prime suspect in the 1996 Atlanta Olympic bombing before the actual bomber was identified years later. Jewell was never charged. He sued several media outlets for defamation and settled with a number of them. He spent the rest of his life as a cautionary tale about what happens when arrested quietly becomes guilty in the public imagination before the facts catch up. Hearn's lawyers do not need to invent that comparison. It's sitting right there. And if you want to know what that kind of exposure can actually cost a network, you don't have to guess. In 2023, Fox News paid Dominion Voting Systems $787.5 million to settle a defamation suit over false 2020 election claims, the largest publicly disclosed defamation settlement in American media history, reached the moment internal emails and depositions surfaced, showing people on air knew the claims were shaky and ran them anyway because the ratings were good. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you Hearn has an identical case. The legal bar for proving actual malice is genuinely high, especially if any outlet argues he became a limited-purpose public figure through the coverage itself. That's a real unresolved legal question. and reasonable attorneys disagree about how it shakes out. But the Dominion number exists for a reason. It's the number every general counsel at every network is quietly doing math against right now, because it's proof that we were just reporting what officials told us, stopped being an automatic shield the moment the officials themselves later admitted in writing that what they told everyone wasn't true. Third, and honestly, this is the one that outlasts the news cycle. This isn't really a story about a pool. It's a stress test of what happens when a federal prosecutor's office gets caught between the evidence in front of it and the political preference of the administration that appointed her. Pirro chose the evidence. That is, structurally, supposed to be the entire job description of a U.S. attorney. And she still ended up getting dressed down in the Oval Office for it, in front of reporters, by the man who put her there. She wasn't fired. Sources say Trump was pissed, but held off. But think about the message that sends to every other U.S. attorney's office watching this unfold. Do the right thing when the facts change, and the reward is a public humiliation and an open question about your job security. That's not a hypothetical chilling effect. That's a demonstrated one, with a transcript. So, where does this actually land? Some of it resolves quickly. The criminal case against Hearn either gets buried for good, or the judge lets the door stay cracked open, and we'll know that soon. Some of it drags out for years, the way defamation litigation always does. In depositions and discovery requests, nobody outside a law firm ever reads. But the part that doesn't resolve, the part that just sort of sits there afterward like a stain on the carpet, is the pattern. A rushed public works job, dressed up for a photo opportunity, a scapegoat, produced on demand because admitting a contractor error is less politically convenient than announcing an arrest. A prosecutor punished not for being wrong, but for eventually being right in a way that embarrassed the boss, and a private citizen who went for a bike ride in June and, by August, needed federal defense attorneys to get his name back. The Reflecting Pool, by the way, the actual pool, is still sitting there between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument, drained again, for repairs again. It was built to reflect two of the most permanent things this country has ever put up on purpose. This summer, mostly what it reflected was how quickly the story changes once somebody finally has to put it in writing under oath. I'm Marcus Fenn. This is Borderlines, non-analysis from the edge. If you think stories like this deserve more than a 40-second clip and a shouting match, subscribe, because we're just getting started. And there's a lot more sitting behind this one waiting to surface.